Hi, today we're having a big conversation about some sweeping ideas for how we should conceive of our next choices and our future. Yesterday, Vice President Joe Biden, after sealing the Electoral College, said now is the time to turn the page, to unite, to heal. Some people are calling for justice, others are calling for unity. What is the tension between these two things, and how can we think about that? My next guest is a remarkable person who has addressed this dilemma, has thought about it, and engaged it in a broader context related to the arts. We're very privileged to have with us today Elizabeth Alexander, who is a poet, writer, scholar, and now the president of the Mellon Foundation, the largest charitable foundation supporting the arts in America. She has really won too many awards to name, but one of her many distinctions, less than a handful of poets to have read poetry at a U.S. president's inauguration. She read a poem of hers at President Obama's inauguration. And I'm thrilled to be joined. Hi.
Hi.
Elizabeth. Hi. Thank you for being here.
My great pleasure. And this is my first IG Live, so I feel it's very momentous, and I feel very accomplished that we're looking at each other.
This is the future, here now. You're doing great. And you've got gorgeous backdrop, so that helps. I really want to have a conversation about this tension between healing and justice, but just so people who haven't experienced your work before and aren't as familiar with the Mellon Foundation understand a little bit about you and your work. I'd love for you to tell us, you are this enormously accomplished poet. You've spent your life writing and thinking about ideas, but you were the grantee. What's it like to be the grantor now, the person writing the checks, making decisions? Has it been challenging to figure that out, or is it just fun?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that, all along in my life as an educator, which is also an important part of this too, college professor for decades, and building in the field of African American studies, which is to say, having difficult conversations in the classroom with literature, culture, and history as our stuff, our material, our guide, our common ground, and coming out on the other side of those conversations and seeing how in the world of poetry, especially amongst the arts, it's profoundly under-resourced, and yet it has an indelibleness, an invincibility that has gone across time, space, generation, all around the world. So being able to think about what it means to have to be resourceful, being able to be undaunted in the face of trying to open up the narrative, to bring more voices to the table, to have difficult conversations. What's been glorious about my time, and by the way, doing it without Mellon Foundation grants. So not the grantee, but the maker and the teacher, to be able to come and say, okay, how can we support and lift up these values, these ideas, these people, and especially those voices we haven't heard from as much, especially those people who aren't sitting in the center, but have so much to say to us. And in the United States context, who make up the complicated story of who we are. If it were easy, you would give away all the money in 5 minutes, because there's so much that's good, and there's so much that wonderful people can do with their resources. But to think about how to do it strategically so that powerful ideas lift a bit and can inspire others, that's what is the really wonderful challenge. And it feels like I've been preparing for it, though I never in a million years would have dreamed that this is what
You took the job at a remarkable time. I think you started in 2018, and we've seen just a period of tumult between social action in the streets, the pandemic, the effects of all the police killing of George Floyd incited an entire new conversation at a public level, a broad level. And you've decided to refocus on social justice. Can you explain to us why you made that decision and how you think the arts can impact our conversation in a way that maybe politics alone can't, or social action alone can't?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that, because of the formal shift into our strategic mode as a social justice organization and the events of this year, many people have thought that there was a causality But in fact, before I came to the foundation, I said, if I'm the person you want, what I'm going to do is turn us in a social justice direction and ask questions about equitable distribution of resources. And again, you know, whose voices haven't been supported and lifted up. And that is consistent with my whole life, with my whole family life for generations before it, with my whole, you know, being an African-American person and coming from a sense that there is so much brilliance in our culture, in our literature. There is so much endurance and extraordinariness in our history, and knowing that most people don't know those stories. You know, it's a long, 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 long road. I think that what the arts can do, but what I'll say about this year is that I do think that in this converging moment, along with COVID, which hit people of color so disproportionately in every single way, along with living through a time where from the highest levels of our country, hateful and divisive rhetoric was spewed to us on the regular, where racism and misogyny was authorized in a way that had been a little bit underground for a while. And when you open that Pandora's box, people come out and start dancing because they've been invited to a party. So what that has shown me is the importance of making space, not only for others, but for, you know, we not only support arts and culture, we support the humanities, the study of what it means to be human. And I think that in art and culture and learning, that is where we say, I see you, I hear you, I learn about you, I understand the world through your eyes. That is a superpower that art has that nothing else has. And so that's why I believe in it so fervently.
It's an access point for empathy.
It's an access point for empathy. And I think even let's add another word to it, because I think empathy, though it does not, it literally means, as you know, feeling with. But I think that people sometimes take it a little bit further to be kind of like feeling sorry for or pain. And I think literally feeling with. Who are you? What do you come from? What do you value? What song are you singing? Literally exchanging one to the other is what we find in art. Art can also make you simply feel abstract things that don't have to do with individuals necessarily. It can make you feel joyful. It can make you weep. It can make you laugh. It can take you to another place. It can take you to another time. Wow.
I'd love to talk about one of your projects in particular, the Monuments Project. I sometimes say that the Trump years made what was covert overt, and it's forcing public conversations that we have put off for a long time. And one of them is about, well, specifically, we think of Confederate monuments, but you've taken on a project that's about monuments. Can you explain to folks, you're trying to reimagine monuments. What is this project, and why did you tackle this?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking about it. I'm very excited about it. The Monuments Project is the biggest initiative in Mellon's history. $250 million to be spent over 5 years, that is asking the question, primarily in the United States, of how we teach who we are and tell our stories in our built environment. So we take monuments to mean a lot of different things. They can be statues of people. They can be centers where you go and learn. So in that case, I would think about something like the Equal Justice Initiative, Memorial for Peace and Justice, which we support in Alabama. And there you don't see people represented. You have these extraordinary hanging slabs that feel like tombstones that have the names of lynchings across history and that also mark spaces throughout the South where lynchings took place, alongside often roads still named for Confederate generals. Something like the Arab American Museum in Detroit, the only one in this country telling the story of those Americans, those people who are part of our country. We're thinking about building new things. We're thinking about recontextualizing problematic existing things. So for one example of that we didn't support, but I think is kind of perfect, is there's a statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond on Monument Boulevard. and the artist Dustin, I don't want to get his name wrong, Dustin Klein, I'm going to say. Check it. Did these extraordinary projections of Sojourner Truth, of Harriet Tubman, of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, so that what you see is you see this form of this Confederate over-venerated in this country for a lost cause, right? And over it are the people who fought against that ideology of white supremacy, and also some people who still today were the victim of that ideology. So, you know, it's gonna let us, you know, who belongs here has also been a very fraught question, you know, horribly. And I think that how the environment around us teaches us is very closely tied to questions of belonging.
So it's my understanding that with the Monuments Project, some of it, you kind of leave it to a community to decide, is this correct? Should this, let's just take, for example, a Confederate statue, should it be allowed to stand with something putting context around it, explaining this history? Should it be reimagined, as you're saying, contrasted with modern day reality, or should it be torn down? Who should make those decisions, and how do you make that decision?
That's a great question. So first of all, I can't make those decisions. I can't take Mellon money and just go around pulling things out of the ground. You know, we actually can't do that. These kinds of monuments projects are very complicated with multiple parties involved, sometimes with government parties involved. So what we look for is coalitions, communities, institutions who say, this is how we want to deal with this. And then we look at, you know, many more proposals than we could ever say yes to. We apply our own strategic sense of things, and then we think about what we're going to help and who we're going to support. And I think, just to say one thing about the Confederate monuments that is so important, it's not the only thing that we're addressing. However, when you consider that most of these Confederate monuments, again, the Civil War has been lost. Decades and decades and decades later, people are erecting these monuments to continue to contest that result and to continue to put forth a rhetoric that says that white people are superior and black people are inferior and even sometimes subhuman. And when you and those monuments become rallying cries, gathering places. Those monuments are often put up places. There are Robert E. Lee monuments in places where he never even set foot. So, you know, if a monument should be about telling the history, sort of, if you will, from the ground up of the place where you are, they actually don't read properly when you think about all the places that they are. The National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., put up stained glass windows with Robert E. Lee in them in 1953.
Oh, I didn't know that. I've been there so many times.
But here's what's really, really profound about what they decided to do. They recently took those windows out. And why? They said, because they are an impediment to worship. So this was a community on its own saying, you know, we didn't really do this all this long ago, but what we did was wrong. And so we're going to, and they said, we don't, you know, are we going to put it in a museum? Are we going to put it somewhere else? No, we're not going to answer that question, because we actually have to reckon with not only what it meant that we did that, but also what do we vision in our space that tells the story of who we are and embraces this worship community. I think that's a really interesting example.
Would you talk about, there are instances, for example, the Robert E. Lee that had the projection of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Why is removal not always the answer? Why is retaining some of these monuments important, or is it?
I think sometimes removal is the answer. So let's be clear about that. Again, I think I'll give you, I think the examples and the stories are good. So much depends on what teaching institutions or communities are there to, if you will, teach the conflict, right? Mm-hmm. What are people, you know, there was a monument to the Confederacy in Selma, Alabama, that was outside of a high school in the middle of a black community. And that community said, we can't have our kids going to school every day with someone who says that they're subhuman embodied in front of them. And so what they suggested, and there was tremendous backlash, but eventually that was moved to the Confederate graveyard, where I laid eyes on it, and it is lovingly tended. So, okay, but it's in the as is the whole graveyard, by the way. And then what that leaves to do is for that community in Selma to say, well, what are we going to remember? Now, interestingly, they've got the Edmund Bridge.
Yeah.
And, some people don't feel that it should anymore be named for Edmund Pettus. They think it should be the John Lewis Bridge. They think it should be, so I think that what to me is always the interesting question, and people answer it in different ways, is we can't not know our history. I want to know that in 1953 in the National Cathedral, when, by the way, Washington, D.C. was still segregated, I want to know that they did that. But I also want to see how they're evolving. And maybe even more importantly, I want to know who were the other powerful voices who aren't on a stained glass window and aren't memorialized, so that everybody can understand the tremendous history that we can learn from and be inspired by.
It's interesting. I've wanted to talk to you for a long time because I know your work. And I thought of you because I've been thinking about this dilemma that the whole nation is facing coming ahead, which is this tension between justice and healing. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the Monuments Project, in a way, addresses that to, has that conversation. And I wonder if we could have a little bit of that conversation in light of the fact that President-elect Biden yesterday, he said, it's time to turn the page. We've done, as we've done throughout our history, it's time to unite and to heal. And, there's a polling, an NBC YouGov poll shows 41% of the people think Biden should prioritize unifying the country. That should be his main goal. But, during the election, we heard both Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren say that the Justice Department has no choice but to prosecute President Trump after he leaves office because the president is not above the law. So I wonder how you think we have this. Do you think it's possible to pursue both justice and healing at the same time?
That's such a great question. And I think we should take it apart and then put it back together again.
Okay.
Because I think, one premise of healing that I think has to really be examined is who does the work. There are people who have been injured. Yeah. There are people who have been disparaged. There are people who are living in a country where their chances are far less than other people who simply have a different color skin. There are people who, in mixed circumstances, mixed of all kinds, I'm not just talking about racial, I'm talking about class, I'm talking about, ethnicity. There are some people who have always been on the side of having to explain themselves. There are people who have always had to hold out a hand and say, see, look, I'm not going to bite. This is who I am. Oh, you know nothing about my heritage and my people, even though it's American history? Let me take a moment and explain to you. Let me teach you for the 900th time. We have equations that are that imbalanced. So when we say healing, to come out and have a handshake is insulting in some cases, because sometimes healing means that you think about what you might be responsible for, and you think about what the other person has had to endure. I think that, for everyone, but, let's just speak as, the mother of African-American boys, our young men have been terrorized. Our beautiful, beautiful young men. Watching Ahmaud Arbery hunted by two self-appointed vigilantes and shot down while exercising. Just take that one story. And think about a mother. Think about, what it means to simply be in your skin and be seen as dangerous. I think more and more people are understanding that. And taking it on. The poet Gwendolyn Brooks really exemplifies so much for me. And she really teaches in all of her work children have to be our children.
Mhm.
We have to think of other people as belonging to us. It has to hurt us the same way. And that this story goes back for the, a couple generations before. It was the story of Emmett Till, which is remembered so powerfully at the Museum for African American History and Culture in Washington, where Emmett Till's coffin is the one thing in that museum that you can't photograph, because that story is so iconic and it's such a sacred text for America about the things that we still haven't worked out about who we say is dangerous and whose life matters less. So I say all of that to say that the business of healing requires some self-work too.
Mhm.
And we don't start off in an even place. And so that's why I keep returning to knowledge, to teaching, to reading, to art, to history. And what I like about, monuments and teaching institutions is that they're in public space that we can all access. When you're going down the street with a child and you look up and there's, you're on 100 and I think it's 15th Street in New York City, and beautiful Allison Sarr, Harriet Tubman sculpture,
Mhm.
statue. And the kid says, "Who's that?" And then you tell them the story. This woman made 19 trips to take people to freedom from slavery. Like, a child of any color. That is extraordinary. But I think it's that learning that has to take place before or alongside the coming together to heal, as we think about the premises on which we hope to come together.
I have so many questions. One is, do you think that to get to healing, there has to be a moment of, I'm going to use the wrong word, but vengeance, justice, rebalancing the scales?
I think there has to be a moment of redress. I do. I think that, that's not, just sort of, it's very complicated. It's very tit for tat. But, the violence that is done to people when you ask them to ignore their history, forget what happened to them, act like it doesn't matter, keep on moving. That is violence.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think that like some version of truth and reconciliation, or what is atonement
Yeah.
about, or what does it mean to reckon? What is a reckoning? What I think they all have in common is we're not going to act like this didn't happen. We're not going to act like we're not all made out of what has happened to us.
It's interesting because I'm thinking a lot of what I hear you talking about is action on a local level, like what a parent can do with their own child, what a community can do in their space. And is there a piece that government can do or that our national leadership must do going forward?
Well, for sure. I mean, and I think that leadership really matters. What people embody, what they do. I mean, now I'm leading an organization, and I assume that people are watching to see who I hire, to
Mm.
see what ideas I elevate, to see how I conduct myself. To see what those values are. So right now, people are watching very carefully, appropriately, challenging. Even, President-elect Biden said himself that he expects to be challenged. He wants to be challenged hard on who he puts into these very consequential jobs. What are the things that he lifts up? What will he do with the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts? How will those, and this is not just the president, but also, Congress and Senate. There are other people whose government fund the arts to a much greater extent than we do. So what will we decide that we want to do with that? Presidents can do all kinds of special commissions, and, we've seen some of them used to put forth, fake history, literally. So what would it look like to have some really powerful historical reckoning White House conferences?
Oh, that's interesting.
It could be
What
a
could that look like?
It could look extraordinary. I mean, I'm thinking about all of the, we've been having these beautiful conversations out of Mellon with great historians like David Blight, who's written about the Civil War in memory, Natasha Trethewey, the poet and memoirist, who's written about growing up an illegal child, as she says, born to a white father and a black mother in segregated Mississippi, growing up in the shadow of Stone Mountain. We had a range of people coming together. Paul Farber, who runs the Monuments Lab, Brent Staples, who for the New York Times op-ed page called our attention to all of the U.S. Army bases that are named for Confederates. I mean, so think about all these opportunities. If you think about also in the Obama presidency, all of the culture that they brought into the White House. And then, so many of those things were broadcast on PBS. So there was the country music one, and there was and Earth, Wind, and Fire was there, and there was Latinx music, and all kinds of things that said, all of this is American culture, and it's for everybody. And so I think that there are, and I'm totally excited to see, the fact that we have an educator in the First Lady, I'm so excited to see what they will do.
It's so interesting. So you're talking about expanding the way we think about what this process looks like. It's not just what happens at the Justice Department. It's what happens. Sorry?
Although that matters.
Yeah. You brought up some of the arts and culture we saw in the Obama years. Is that appropriate at a time when people are dying in this pandemic, at this time of suffering, when the economy is struggling? Is there a way to have sort of celebrations and joy in the midst of this without it seeming to diminish or deny what other people are going through?
Oh, well, I think, we've got to live, we've got to live, and we've got to know what we're living through. And and we've got to know why we live. And I think arts and culture, and our historians, imagine if we went through just 2020. Let's just take 2020 and the pandemic. Let's just isolate that part of it. And all the isolated people, and all the fear, and all of the inequality, and all of the loss and the sorrow, and all of the feeling that our government wasn't taking care of us, wasn't helping as much as they could. I want there to be scholars and artists and poets who tell us, make meaning of that, who make meaning of what we've been through, who put it in the context of other times of stress and strain and fear in the history of humanity. This is how we understand what we go through, and this is what gives us a companion to keep our life force afloat, because we gotta survive.
This is great advice for the incoming administration, I think. I don't want to let you go without asking you about the piece you wrote for the New Yorker about the Trayvon generation. For folks who didn't have a chance to read it, and I'll link to it, it's about the experience of raising Black boys in our culture. I wonder, can you first describe who is the Trayvon generation? What's the reality of this experience?
Yeah, the Trayvon generation is a generation of young, not kids of color mostly, but also they have a lot of white friends and allies who have also, I think, been traumatized alongside them, who have grown up. Racial violence is not new to this country. But if you think about Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, Breonna Taylor, all of these murders, so many of them have been filmed. And this is the first generation that's been able to see them on their phones, which is to say, sometimes they see them when they're alone, and not when they are with parents who might, shield or break frightening news and talk about it together. They can see it over and over and over again. the cases are one after the other, after the other, after the other. We're seeing the extent of police violence against Black people, and sometimes civilian violence against Black people. So what does it mean to be very young people? You know, people who were of Emmett Till's generation. He was murdered in Mississippi in 1955. There is an entire body of literature. There is an entire generation from that one murder, which they saw in a picture in Jet magazine, who say, it forever gave me fear. It forever made me understand my vulnerability. It forever made me the South was a place I could never go. It forever made me understood I had to be a warrior and vigilant in my own country. That was one case. These kids have seen countless cases. And so what I'm concerned about with them is, first of all, that as grown-ups, we love them, that we love them. I used a Gwendolyn Brooks phrase, gobbling mother eye, that we turn that gobbling mother eye onto them and understand. And I think that we're seeing this in a lot of the art that these people have produced, a lot of depression, actually. And I think that, you know, talking about depression and fear with young Black people who are thought to be in certain ways invincible because they've withstood so much, I think we have to understand that our young people are vulnerable. And I think we have to understand that the trauma of witness is something that's very, very real.
So finally, we've talked about sort of taking local action to open our minds and engage our communities. This audience is an audience largely of parents, young parents with kids. I wonder if there's, and they want actions, they want solutions. Is there anything you can advise people read or art they see to be able to have a conversation or help their children understand in a different way how to grow up as part of a Trayvon generation or as friends of people who are experiencing this trauma in a profound way to help your kids cope?
Well, honestly, I think to me, you know, the answer is not in one book, right? It's widespread exposure. It is in widespread cultural learning. It is about understanding that at the center of the American experience is Native experiences, Black experiences, Latinx experiences, Arab American experiences, Asian American experiences. So, you know, filling ourselves white experiences of being American are a part of being American, but they must not be centered. Rather, what we're trying to do is understand the multivocality of our experience, which to me, it's the hard and beautiful work of everyday, ongoing hunger, curiosity, learning, so that, you know, your kids, so many of the young people I taught in universities at the end of our beautiful, hard semesters together, no one ever taught me this. Why teach me this? And so I feel like starting that journey early in all of its multiplicity is what it's really important for parents of young people to do. And of course, also what they already know to do, which is love your children to bits, love your children to pieces, but love other people's children as your own.
Powerful. Thank you. I hope you're getting a break, a pandemic kind of break for the holidays.
There will be a lovely break, and I'm really looking forward to it. And my young people are 21 and 22.
So big young people.
Big young people. So I'm really excited to be spending some time with them safely.
That's great. Yes, right. All pandemic safety.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Alexander, thank you for your time. I want to tell the audience they can follow the Mellon Foundation on Instagram, and I'll post all the information to do that. And I'll post some information on the Monuments Project. I'm grateful for the conversation and would love to regroup next year when we see what the Biden administration brings.
I would love to do it. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was a good piece of soul in the middle of the day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Take good care.